So we've been talking about grief, and in this video, I will be addressing the different types of grief. Now, one of the types of grief that I would like to address is normal grief. Normal grief is when you are able to go through a loss and then you are able to mourn and move on into the grieving process without too many complications. Now, according to research, 6 months, after 6 months, we normally think that you are going to be able to adjust to the newness of what things are now after the loss. Let me just use the analogy of death or the experience of death. During that first month, there is a lot of things that have to be done. The whole going through the mourning process into the burial of that individual, which takes about 2 weeks. And so during those first 2 weeks, you have a lot of people around you. And then you go into the third, the fourth week, then you're kind of recovering from the activities of the mourning period. Around week 5 is when the grief, that's when it begins to hit. And you begin to experience a lot of emotions, which we will be talking about as we talk about the stages of grief. By the time you get to the 6th week and moving forward, you've already started the grieving process. You are more aware of it, and you begin to move through the stages, whether you know them or not. The intensity of the sadness, the intensity of the feelings of loss, they will be heightened, and then over time, as you move through the stages of grief and you get into a space of acceptance and adjusting into the newness, and so you kind of find your new normal, and by the time 6 months are coming around, you are in a better space. So it is important to know if after 6 months, after 1 year, the emotions are still very intense, then that means that you do need much more support than just family and social support, that you do need that expert to come in and help you walk through the grief. The complicated grief, which is another type of grief, is what we might also call traumatic grief. Now, most of the time, complicated grief is what we might say that you have stayed in mourning too long. So you are still feeling the intense emotions of the loss of this person, the loss of whatever was you lost, which was very important to you, and it causes you to not be able to do what we normally call moving on. And so you are, even though your life continues to go, there is no happiness. There are these emotions that hit you when you are triggered, and they are very intense. Normally, when you have complicated grief, it could be connected to other grief issues you have had in the past. What psychologically is going on, and mentally. And when I say mentally, I'm talking about the narrative in your mind. Usually, psychologically, you feel like you're being violated, you are being punished for something. Like you feel it's unfair. You are not able to understand why the loss happened in the first place. And then you have also people who experience current loss, and it wakes up unresolved losses from the past. And so now the experience they have currently is not just about this loss, it's about many other losses that have not been processed, they haven't been resolved, so to speak. And so they are not able to adjust very well, and usually psychologically they stay stuck in that mourning period, and it lasts for a long time, and it can eventually develop into what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. When you find that you are unable to move along the grief process, that you seek professional help, and people are able to help you unstuck from that mourning period. Then we have what we call ambiguous loss. An ambiguous loss is when you have lost someone, but they are still living. You can look at that from the aspect of relationships. So we are talking about breakups. We are talking about divorce. We are talking about things like that, where somebody hurts you in a very deep way, and then there is a breakup of that relationship, whether it is a friendship, whether it is an intimate relationship, and it doesn't matter whether the relationship was abusive or not, or toxic or not, you still experience the loss of it, because every relationship starts off with promise, it starts off with a future in mind, it starts off with certain expectations of what this person is going to be to you and who you are going to be to them. And then when that is taken away, there is a deep, deep feeling of loss. However, those feelings, even though they are very similar to the death, experiencing the death of a loved one, it's not a death. And so sometimes we get confused. How come I cannot move along? I can't move on. There are people who tend to stay in these toxic relationships. They leave and they come back. They leave and they come back. Again, that is a person who is stuck in the process of mourning this relationship, and once they leave, it feels like they can't be able to adjust to living without the relationship, and so they stay stuck in that. You need to know, if you are experiencing that you are staying in that grief, in that mourning of the loss of that relationship. Now, there is also another type of loss that we normally call anticipatory grief. And anticipatory grief, basically it's when you are expecting someone to die because either they are in a terminal illness, and it's almost like people expect that because somebody has been sick for a long time, that people are prepared for the person to depart. But anticipatory grief does not mean that you are going to be feeling the loss after the person dies much less painful than if you didn't know they were going to die. Anticipatory grief is when we are expecting someone to be taken away from us, even though we don't know when. We still grieve the fact that we are going to lose them at some point. It's important to understand that these are the types of loss, the types of grief that you would experience, and it's usually very confusing. Why am I not being able to move on? So understanding this process and these types of grief will help you to look at your situation and decide that you do need to talk to a professional so that they can support you through the process of grief.